As we begin today, let's just take a moment in gratitude for Father Martin for taking the time to join us and to allow us to continue this important conversation. Let us always be mindful of every young person that comes into our schools and allow God to give us the strength and the wisdom to know how to serve each of them and always to accept them, to love them for who they are and the gift they are in our world. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So it is my great privilege today to be able to continue our conversation that we began this summer with the presidents and principals in Long Branch on this topic of inclusion. We've asked, thanks to Kevin's connection, we've been able to secure Father Martin to be with us today for this hour. Father James Martin is a Jesuit priest, author, and editor at large at America, the National Catholic magazine. His most recent book is titled Building a Bridge: How the Catholic Church and the LGBT community can enter into a relationship of respect, compassion, and sensitivity, published by Harper One. He is a frequent communicator in the media about issues of spirituality and religion, and is known for his many appearances on the Colbert Report and also his robust social media appearances. Father James was born in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business in 1982, where he received a bachelor in economics with a concentration in finance. After working for 6 years in the corporate world, he joined the Society of Jesus in 1988. During his Jesuit novitiate in Boston, Father James worked at a hospital for seriously ill in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as well as a hospice for the sick and dying with the Missionaries of Charity in Kingston, Jamaica, and also at the Nativity Mission Center, a school for poor children in New York City. In 1990, he professed his simple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then began his philosophy studies at Loyola University in Chicago, as well as working at an outreach program for street gang members in the Chicago housing projects during that time. For his regency assignment, he worked for 2 years with the Jesuit Relief Services in Nairobi, Kenya, where he helped East African refugees start small businesses and co-founded a refugee handcraft shop called the Mikano Center, and for 1 year as an associate at an editor at America in New York City. In 1995, Father Martin began his graduate studies at what was then the Western Jesuit School of Theology, which is now Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he earned a master's in divinity as well as a master's in theology, and went in his spare time worked as a chaplain at a Boston prison. After completing his Jesuit studies, he was ordained a Catholic priest in 1999, and in 2009 pronounced his final vows as a member of the Society of Jesus. Father Martin is an award-winning author of many books. His book, Between Heaven and Mirth: Why Joy, Humor, and Laughter Are at the Heart of Spiritual Life, was named as one of the best books of 2011 by Publishers Weekly. His many books have also been translated into 9 languages. Father Martin has received 7 honorary doctorates from many prestigious colleges around our country and numerous other prestigious awards during his career as well. In 2017, Pope Francis appointed him to the Vatican Department for Communications. And also in 2019, Pope Francis offered him the opportunity to sit down and chat and listen very pastorally to many of the concerns that Father Martin brought forth about the LBG Catholics and the LBG community worldwide. Besides his editorial, publishing, and media work, Father Martin has been invited by Catholic dioceses and archdioceses around our country to speak with clergy and laity. He has spoken at numerous colleges and universities, has taught at Marist, at Boston College's Summer Institute, and leads many seminars and directs many retreats at retreat houses around our country. On Sundays, he assists at the Church of Ignatius Loyola in New York. And it is my distinct pleasure, Father Martin, to welcome you and to join this conversation today. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the prayer. I'm so honored to be with you all today. I want to thank Brother Dan and Kevin and Brother Owen and everyone who has arranged this. It's really an honor. I'm such a huge fan of the Marist Brothers Schools and your charism. And I am not an expert in education, but I thought we could enter into a conversation today about how to reach out to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and sometimes they like to be called siblings. And as Kevin said earlier, most of the conversation is going to be question and answer because I think it's much more lively. I think it's much more practical. Marcelin Champagnat talked about practical compassion. And so I think that's better also than listening to me go on for a long time. I want to start, though, with the charism of the Marist brothers that I know you're probably much more familiar with than I am. And I first was introduced to St. Marcelin when I visited Marist College in Poughkeepsie a few years ago and was given a pamphlet on him and read his whole story. I'm always interested in the saints. But for this talk, I was researching a little bit more about his life. And I always think that, I was saying this to Brother Dan, I believe that when we are reaching out to a group like LGBTQ people, which might seem new, right? We can always draw on the resources of our charisms, particularly schools and parishes and institutions that were founded by and inspired by religious orders. I would say, I wouldn't say this outside, but I think kind of have an extra edge, you could say, because there's a great spirituality to draw on. When you talk, for example, to schools run by women's religious orders, often these women, the women foundresses, had to sort of contend with all sorts of problems, and they were doing things that were very different. So, so there's a lot of sort of foundational work that we can look at. So what I'd like to look at briefly, just are a few phrases that might help you from your own charism, and then from some of your documents. Then I'd like to sort of talk about some gospel stories to help sort of frame our discussion. So, St. Marcelin, in the documents of the Marist brothers, went to minister to the most neglected. That's a phrase that really popped out to me. And who are the most neglected people in our church today, right? And sometimes in our society, they are, in fact, LGBTQ people. Now, of course, there's lots of other people that are neglected, and refugees and the poor, and you could say women. But I think within the church, within the Catholic world, probably the most neglected group are LGBTQ people. I think everybody in the Catholic Church would say, of course, we have to help the poor and refugees and the sick and women. And you might not get that same response when you talk about LGBTQ people. So I want to frame it first in terms of the most neglected. Second, in terms of St. Marcelin's idea of practical and the Marist brothers' idea of practical compassion. I think, when you look at questions of how to react to certain situations, I think that's a great model, practical compassion, right? In the Jesuits, we talk about discernment, right? It's not one size fits all, but it's something that sort of reflects the needs and the on the ground realities, right? It's very practical. It's very down to earth. Brother Dan can talk about this later, but St. Marcelin also had an encounter with a young man named Jean-Baptiste Montaigne, right? Where he meets the young man where he is. Maybe we can talk about that a little later. So an example in his life of just meeting someone where they are and not being as concerned about, certain rules and regulations. But the thing that really struck me, and I'm going to pull this up on my own page, I'm not going to share it with you, comes from a document, excerpts relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion from In the Footsteps of Marcelin Champagnat, A Vision for Marist Education Today. And I just want to look at 3 sentences that I think can really help us in our discussion. The first is this: fidelity to our charism, to the Marist brothers' charism, requires us to be constantly alert to the evolving social and cultural forces that have a profound effect on the self-perception of young people. Can you get any more specific about LGBTQ people than that? The self-perception of young people. How do they see themselves as beloved children of God? How do they see themselves as welcome in the church? How do they see themselves welcome as in a Catholic school? So the profound influence on the self-perception of young people and on their spiritual, emotional, social, and physical well-being. So much of what we're going to talk about this afternoon is about the well-being of these LGBTQ students, and sometimes, faculty members, right? And board members and things like that, trustees, and talk about high schools, parents, right? So the self-perception of young people and on their spiritual, emotional, social, and physical well-being. We want to keep that idea of well-being in mind when we're looking at what we're going to talk about today. Often, however, this is also really powerful. Often, however, we find from the same document, we find young people who are discouraged, disoriented, or for whom life is a daily struggle. Now, I think one of the most important groups of that describes that would be LGBTQ kids. Discouraged, disoriented often, and for whom life is a daily struggle. Not all the time, but really coming into your own and coming to understand your own sexuality, your gender identity, which is even more of a modern concept, is a real struggle. We see them dealing with learning difficulties, personal disabilities, and lack of acceptance from peers. So here this is buried or not so buried right within your documents. We hear the call, especially the brothers, to even take the risk of giving up some of our security and going to where no one else is going, to the peripheries or the frontier. Okay. And I think, again, within the Catholic Church, these are the peripheries and these are the frontiers. Pope Francis has asked us to meet people on the frontiers and on the peripheries. And oftentimes we think of that in terms of the poor, refugees and migrants. I mean, sort of the physical peripheries, but there's also kind of the ecclesial and the social peripheries, you know, where people are LGBT, particularly in the church, right, are sort of marginalized, are kind of on the peripheries. All right. So I think within the Marist Brother Charism, there are resources that can help you and help us, and those of you who are working in Marist schools, to understand these things. Okay. But I think even more basically, there are resources within the Gospels. There are resources. So we look at St. Marcelin and we look at the Marist Brothers Charism, but more foundationally, we can look at the Gospels. And what I'd like to do very briefly is to look at 3 gospel stories that I think will help us understand how Jesus reached out to people who were on the margins. So remember that idea of going to the frontiers, going to the peripheries, you know, which may sound, you know, a lot of times I find that people say, oh, this is all kind of new, you know, contemporary stuff, or it's all Vatican II stuff, or, you know, but this is foundational. Okay. Simply because it was highlighted in Vatican II or highlighted in some of the contemporary documents of the Marist Brothers does not mean it came out of nowhere. Okay. All right. So I'm going to look at 3 gospel stories. The first one is the story of the Roman centurion. Now, I don't know how old everybody is on this webinar, but if you're of a certain age, I was just watching the other night in 1977, Franco Zeffirelli had that great movie, Jesus of Nazareth. It was on TV, and it used to be on TV all the time at Easter and Christmas. And this character is played by Ernest Borgnine. So in case you remember that scene, I see Brother Owen is smiling. He remembers that. But for those of you that are a little more traditional, we go back to the gospel story itself. So Jesus is in Capernaum, and Capernaum is a town of about 1,500 people. It's on the seaside of the shore of the Sea of Galilee. I've been there a couple times. You can go see the ruins. And Capernaum, you know, unlike other places that we think of like Nazareth and Bethlehem and Jerusalem that really figure into our Catholic and Christian consciousness, Capernaum really doesn't figure into it, but it's a very important place in Jesus's ministry. Okay. He would have spent probably 3 years there, was his home base of ministry in Galilee. Okay. It's quite a surprise when people go to Capernaum because they Catholics don't really think about that often. There's, you know, you might know about Nazareth College, or you might know about, you know, something named after Jerusalem, but when's the last time you went to a Capernaum college or a Capernaum center? But it's a big part of Jesus's life. In any event, in that city, in Capernaum, is a Roman centurion, someone in charge of 100 men, who comes up to Jesus and asks for healing for his servant. Okay. And Jesus offers to come to his house, or it's implied that he offers to come to his house. And the centurion says, well, no, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. All right. These are words that we say every Sunday or every day at Mass, depending on if you go to daily Mass. I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Only say the word and my servant will be healed. And he says, moreover, look, I'm a person who has people under authority. I say to one man, go, and he goes. I say to another man, do this, and he does it. I say to another man, come, and he comes. So all you need to do is say the word. And Jesus says, never in Israel have I seen faith like this. You know, go home, your servant is healed. And depending on the gospel story, someone comes from the centurion's house, which, by the way, you can still see in Capernaum, and says, your servant is healed. Okay, now, what are we to make of that story? Well, the primary lesson probably is Jesus's ability to heal, right? And his power over illness. It's also something about Jesus's word. So Jesus's word affects what it says, right? The way that God says, "Let there be light," and there's light. Jesus says, "This person's healed," and he's healed. He doesn't need a potion. He doesn't need magic formula. He doesn't need a wand, right? It's just his word. So there's a connection between Jesus as the word, right? The logos, but also Jesus is the creative quality of Jesus's word. It affects what it says. Okay. So that's which is true. All that's true. But there's something else, and this is where I think it really sort of relates to what we're talking about. Who is this Roman centurion? Okay, this is a man who is completely outside of the Jewish milieu, right? He's not a Jew. Now, we know from one gospel that he's nice to the Jewish people because he built the synagogue. He provided the funds for the synagogue to be built in Capernaum. You can still see the ruins there. But nonetheless, he is an outsider. Moreover, he is not someone that believes in God, right? He's not a monotheist. He probably believes in multiple Roman gods, maybe the whole constellation of Roman gods. He probably takes household gods with him from, let's say he came from Rome to Palestine. Okay. Notice how Jesus treats this person who is not in his religious tradition, right? Does he say to him, "You sinful person"? Right? Does he say, "Get away from me"? Does he say, "I'm not going to speak with you"? Does he say, "Come back when you're Jewish"? Does he say, "I'm only going to speak to Jewish people"? No. How does he treat someone, to go back to that word from St. Marcelin, how does Jesus treat someone on the peripheries? With respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Okay. He praises the man's faith. Oftentimes, when we think about LGBTQ people, we think about, I'm sure you've heard those stories of LGBTQ people who are fired from their jobs at parishes or churches or high schools or colleges sometimes, and they stay in the church, right? They remain in the church, or they hear something terrible from their pastor, right? Every day I get messages from people through social media about terrible things that their priests or brothers or sisters or deacons or pastoral associates at parishes or Catholic school teachers or principals, all sorts of people, all sorts of kind of public representatives of the church say to these people, and they remain in the church. And so sometimes you can say about these people who feel like they're on the peripheries, the same thing that Jesus said about the centurion. How great is their faith? So Jesus praises the faith of this man on the outside, and then he does this great service for him. Okay, so this is the way that this is the first example, the way that Jesus treats someone on the peripheries, with tremendous compassion, with respect, with that practical compassion that St. Marcelin talked about, right? Someone on the periphery. So really keep that in mind. By the way, and remember that the one person we quote during the Mass it's not Mary or Joseph or Peter, it's this guy. "Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed." We're quoting an outsider at Mass every day. So that's the first story, I think, that just helps us put this into a context. The second story is the story of the woman at the well, right? A great story from the Gospel of John, also called the Samaritan woman. So as it's described, Jesus is traveling through Samaria. And as everybody knows, I'm sure, the Jews and Samaritans were often at odds. It's about religious practices and where the sort of seat of worship should be. For Jews, it was in Jerusalem. For Samaritans, it was in Mount Gerizim. Okay, so real kind of tension there. There's a woman, and she's described at going to the well at 12 noon. Now, we might say, not a big deal. It's kind of an atmospheric thing that John put in the gospel. Why is she there at 12 noon? Well, we find out because she's been married 5 times and is living with a man who's not her husband. She's ostracized. Now, that's why she's coming the hottest time of the day. That's why John puts that little detail in. When I worked in, Brother Dan was talking about, I worked in Africa for 2 years, and I used to see women going to the pumps, the water pumps in the morning when it was cool. Okay. So this woman cannot go with all the other women because she's ostracized because of her sexual sins and her irregular sexual situation. Okay, so here's something that really kind of relates a lot to LGBTQ people who are often marginalized because of certain social norms. Okay, I'm not calling them sinful. I'm just saying these are people who are on the frontiers like this woman. So Jesus comes to see this woman. There's two reasons. There's actually three reasons he shouldn't be talking to her. One, she's a woman. She's unaccompanied. Two, she's had this very strange and unusual past, right? And three, she's a Samaritan. So three reasons she should be on the frontiers, three reasons why Jesus shouldn't be associating with her at all, right? So what happens? Well, he goes to the well and he asks her for a drink of water. And I'm paraphrasing, and he says, I have water that if you drink it, you'll never be thirsty again. And she says, well, give me that water. I don't want to have to keep coming back to this well. It's what scripture scholars call Johannine misunderstanding, right? From the Gospel of John. People don't quite understand Jesus. And then they have a long conversation. Jesus reveals himself as the living water, right? I am the living water, one of the great I am statements in John. And then she leaves her jug behind and she goes and proclaims the gospel to the Samaritans. A scripture scholar named Sandra Schneiders has compared her to St. Peter. You remember how Peter leaves his nets behind, right? Something that's very important, a great symbol of his entanglements, right? And his past life. She leaves probably the most important thing in her life right now, their jug, right? Behind, which is empty, kind of another interesting symbol. She leaves her jug behind and she goes off to spread the good news. Beautiful story. Okay, now what are we to make of that story? Well, the first thing we can make is that Jesus is the living water, right? One of those great I am statements in John. I am the living water. But again, notice how he treats someone who is on the margins for something that has to do with sexuality. Does he say to her, I'm not going to talk to you because you've been married 5 times? I'm not going to talk to you because you're in this relationship? I'm not going to speak with you because you're a Samaritan woman? No. He has one of the longest conversations in the Gospels with this woman. And then she becomes what? An apostle. Because apostle just means someone who is sent out. And he reveals himself to her. In many places in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't want people to know who he is. He kind of keeps things secret, okay? He reveals himself to her, the Samaritan woman who's been married 5 times and is living with a guy. All right. So again, look how Jesus treats these people. So when we're talking about church teaching on various topics, right? People say, well, what does the church teach on this? This is church teaching. So church teaching is not just a few lines in the catechism. Church teaching is a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And we have to learn from him. And look at how St. Marcelin learned from him, right? Jesus is going out to people on the margins, on the frontiers. And the final story that I want to talk about, and I do want to get to the questions, is the story of Zacchaeus in the Gospel of Luke. So one of my favorite stories, and I would like you to think about Zacchaeus as an emblem of the LGBTQ person in the church or in Catholic institutions. Now, it's not the perfect analogy, but Zacchaeus is described as the chief tax collector in Jericho. Now, so what, right? I mean, that could mean so what? It could be like the accountant or whatever. No, because he's seen as colluding with the Romans. He would have also been seen, say New Testament scholars, as the chief sinner in Jericho. Okay, so that's what we're meant to understand. Now, I'd like you to see the LGBTQ person in line with Zacchaeus, not because LGBTQ people are sinful. My mic just fell off. They're no more sinful than anybody else. Hold on. Sorry. Oh my gosh. But because he would have been the most marginalized person in the town. Hold on just a second. There we go. Sorry about that. A little percussion. He would have been the most marginalized person in the town. Okay, Zacchaeus would have been the most marginalized, the person on the frontiers, the most within that society. So now you have someone who's within Jewish society. So we had a Roman centurion who's outside. We had the Samaritan woman, she's outside. The Roman centurion's doesn't believe in God. The woman at the well is a Samaritan. Now we have a guy who's in Jewish society, but he's marginalized too. So 3 different ways of being marginalized. Jesus is coming through the town. Okay, Jericho is the longest continually inhabited town in the world. He would have had a lot of people with him, probably 100 people. You know, we know there's the 12, there's the 72 disciples that probably traveled with him. There's followers. Jesus was very well known. It's towards the end of his ministry. He's coming through Jericho, and there's Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is described, remember, think of him as an emblem of the LGBT person, as short in stature. Now, that means obviously he's short. He's physically short. But how little stature do LGBTQ people have in our church today? You ever think about that? How little standing or stature? There's all sorts of things in the church. We have Women's Day. We have refugees and migrants who speak up. We have people from the African-American community. When's the last time you were at an official event where an LGBTQ person was invited to speak as a gay person? No, they don't have standing. They don't have stature. Zacchaeus is described as not being able to see Jesus, quote, this is such a beautiful story, on account of the crowd. How often does the crowd get in between people with little stature and Jesus? How often does the church? How often do our Catholic institutions? How often do we get in between the person who has little stature and Jesus? So what does he do? As you know, he climbs the tree, he climbs the sycamore tree. If you go to Jericho today, there's a big sycamore tree called, of course, the Zacchaeus tree. Everybody takes their pictures. He climbs the tree, the sycamore tree, because, quote, he wanted to see who Jesus was. That's what people want. They want to see who God is. They want to experience God. Jesus is coming past. Imagine, it was probably an embarrassing thing for him to do. It was probably ridiculed. Jesus comes by. Who does he call on? He sees all these people. Does he call on the chief rabbi No, he says, you. Hurry down from the tree, for I must stay at your house today. It's a public sign of welcome to this person on the margins, this person everybody hates. Zacchaeus comes down with joy. How often, and I'm sure you've experienced this with your students, how often does the person who's on the margins, the LGBT person, experience joy simply for being accepted like everybody else is, being welcomed? He comes down with joy and he stands his ground. The Greek word is very interesting. Stathes, not just stands there, he stands his ground. Why does he have to stand his ground? Well, because the Gospels tell us, my favorite line in this whole gospel story, again, very important for your work, for our work. And all who saw it began to grumble. All who saw it began to grumble. An offer of mercy to people on the margins always makes some people furious. And I asked a scripture scholar recently about the Greek word that's used. Always good to go back to the Greek. Panta. All means even the disciples. They grumbled. They don't like it. They don't like it that Jesus is reaching out to this person. It's breaking all the rules. He does it anyway. The man comes down from the tree. Zacchaeus is joyful, and he has a conversion experience. Because an encounter with Jesus always provokes a conversion. I don't mean conversion therapy. I mean a metanoia, a change of mind and heart. And he says, I will repay anyone I have defrauded 4 times over, and I will give half of my money to the poor. Now, interestingly, one translation says, I am giving half of my money to the poor. Isn't that interesting? So the person everybody thought was so terrible is actually already giving half of his money to the poor. It depends on the tense that's used. I'm not a Greek scholar. But it provokes a conversion, because any encounter with Jesus provokes a conversion. The kind of conversion we're all called to, a metanoia, a change of mind and heart. Change of mind and heart, okay? Because for Jesus, this is from a scripture scholar, it's welcome first, it's community first, conversion second. For John the Baptist, it's the opposite. It's conversion first, repent, and then you're welcome. And then Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. It's a great story. Now, what is the point of that story? Well, Jesus's outreach to even tax collectors. And here's where the traditional point of the story, and I think the point of the story for us, are the same. Jesus is welcoming someone who is on the outside. And he doesn't say, Zacchaeus, you sinful person. Zacchaeus, get out. Zacchaeus, you're terrible. Zacchaeus, you're breaking these rules. No, he says, I'm coming to your house. It's welcome. So, and yet at the same time, the crowd grumbles, which you see all the time in this kind of ministry, in LGBTQ ministry. So it seems to me when we look at Saint Marcelin, we look at his example, we look at the example of Jesus, that there's two places to, when we look at the Marist brothers charism, there's two places to stand. Seems to me. You can stand with the crowd who grumbles, right? Or you can stand with Jesus. So that's my overview. I think there's so much within the Marist brother charism. I think Dan and Brother Owen could talk about that a little bit more intelligently than I could, certainly. But I think that also those gospel stories help us to sort of set the tone and really provide a foundation for us as we reach out to these people. So thanks very much, and happy to take your questions.
So for our question session, what I'd like you to do is just raise your hand, and then I'll activate your camera so that you can speak directly with Father Martin. So please go ahead and raise your hand. In the meantime, Father Martin, I will start this off just with one of the questions that was submitted when we asked the educators to submit questions. Can we ask students for their pronouns?
You can look, okay. First thing I'm going to say is, I am going to give you the best answers I can. I am also not an expert in education. And so a lot of times I will throw this back to the person, but I would say, I think that's fine. As long as you do something politely and generously and charitably with that practical compassion, I think that's fine. You know, usually the student will tell you, you know, please address me as he, him, her, whatever. Before we start, can I ask Brother Dan very briefly, if you don't mind, can you perhaps tell that story of Saint Marcelin and Jean-Baptiste? I think it might help people.
Yeah, as you know, as many on the call are probably familiar with, Jean-Baptiste Montaigne was a dying boy on the outskirts of Laval, where Champagne, as an early curate priest, began his ministry. And when he went to visit this dying boy, came to realize he knew nothing of God. He spent some time with him and promised him he'd come back to see him again. And when he returned that evening, he had, at that point, had died. And it shook Champagne to the core, to his core, and saying that he never wanted to again see a dying boy that did not come to know who Jesus is, to know who God is. And I think that same example speaks to us today. Who are the Montaignes in our world? Who are the Montaignes in our school? Who are those that we can help bring closer to God by being people of compassion, as Champagne was to the dying boy?
Thank you. It's again, buried in that, within the charism and the history are always these beautiful answers. So thank you.
So, and I did message everybody, if you prefer to use the chat function to ask your question, please do that as well. So staying with the pronouns, Father James, how about teachers introducing themselves using pronouns?
I think that's fine. I think that, look, I read a whole book that just came out, which is, if anyone really wants to get into this, there's a book called The Pink Line by a guy named Mark Jevisser. And it looks at LGBTQ people all over the world. And one of the things that comes out is how important language is for people, right? And so that can be a very powerful sign for kids, particularly if you feel you have LGBTQ kids in your classroom, to let them know that they're welcome. I think basically anything you can do to telegraph a sense that these people are, that these students are welcome is fine. A rainbow flag, or saying this is my pronoun, or let me know what pronouns you're comfortable with. Anything, any step forward usually is enough, if that makes sense. Now I see some of the questions. Did you want to, from Alan?
I'll read that. What's been your experience discussing LGBTQ TQ awareness with parents? When a parent is hesitant to discuss these issues with their children, the child is eager, what should we do? Well,
again, Alan, I'm sure you have experience with this as an educator, you know, with other similar kinds of questions. My experience with LGBTQ awareness with parents is usually after the kid has come out, and they're usually, look, I think most of the times they're very open to it. Okay. Not all the time, but they're open and they just want to help their kid. Right. And they just want to love their kid. And and usually it's, how do we help the kid in church? But oftentimes the parents are fine. Right. when a parent is hesitant to discuss these issues with their children, but the child is eager, what should we do? I would say the same thing you would do in any other situation, in your schools, which is to make yourself available to the kid, right? One of the statistics I like to use is that, LGBTQ kids are more prone to suicide if they have one accepting adult in their lives, and that includes a teacher. They're 40% less likely to attempt suicide. So just one accepting adult, just listening is important. I would say, look, use your this practical compassion and your own experience as educators to help guide you.
Next question. Can you take the Zacchaeus story one step forward? Would the gospel imply that a conversion of the LGBTQ person be required? How should we interpret that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why I wanted to say that the conversion that I'm talking about is the conversion in the gospel is called metanoia, a change of mind and heart. For Zacchaeus, it was, the money, giving the money to the poor. And I'm not talking about conversion therapy, right? I'm not talking about that at all, which is a very dangerous thing. But, for all of us, we're all called to conversion. Do you know what I'm saying? I might be called to conversion in terms of, I don't know, pride or something. Someone else might be called to conversion in terms of laziness. So the example was more to show how Jesus reaches out to those on the margins. But yeah, if LGBT people aren't perfect either, and they're all called to kind of interior conversion as well. But I'm not talking about conversion therapy.
We've got two questions, and I'm going to combine them because
Sure.
they both deal with how to deal with the diocese. And I know the Jesuits had this case with a Catholic high school, Jesuit high school in Indiana, and a teacher. But the question is, when dealing with the Catholic diocese, how do we address homosexuality and transgender at our school? Our Marist approach is very inclusive, but the diocese sometimes holds a hard line on these factors. And then the second question from someone else, how do we remain pastoral as students ask about regulations that come down from the local diocese?
Well, it's a hard thing to answer, and it's hard for a lot of the schools. I think a lot of it, and I'm speaking to obviously presidents and principals, I think a lot of it is keeping the diocese informed. I think one of the things they don't like to have happen is that they be surprised. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is, to remember that, in the Jesuits, we have this term cora personalis, care for the person, that it's care for the student that is uppermost. And I think sometimes it's also willing to advocate for them, really, to take heat, right? I read that quotation that came from your documents that said, hold on a second. We hear the call even to take the risk of giving up some of our security, and I think oftentimes it's difficult and it may be hard to hear, but oftentimes you as principals and presidents of schools may be the only people advocating for these children, right? And for their dignity, something simple as just, like a LGBTQ group or something like that, or even using their pronouns, which I think is pretty mild, in the institutional church. And so part of it is, if we are going to be on the frontiers, we're going to be with people who are going to be getting, kind of stones thrown at them. It's hard. So I think discernment, there's not one size fits all. I also don't think you need to look at the diocese in an antagonistic way. I think a lot of the bishops, if they are brought into these situations, even meeting with the parents, can be very helpful. But I think in the end, sometimes it is being willing to kind of take heat for people on the margins, right? And the other thing I would say is that as educators, who are very familiar with the needs of students and young people, adolescents, again, you know more about education than I do. You may know more about these students' situations than the local diocese does. And so it may be a question of kind of educating them as well, always respectfully, of course, but educating them.
So we've got two questions. A teacher polls his class on pronoun use. Parents call and are upset since we're a Catholic school. How do you respond to the parent?
Well, I would say for every Catholic school parent that calls, there's another Catholic school parent that's grateful that you're taking care of the kid. I would say, look, this is nothing against church teaching, right? You're just trying to be welcoming to the kid, right? I think you're just trying to accommodate the kid. Yes, this is something that people might disagree on, but trying to provide a safe space for the child. I think one of the things that a lot of parents don't recognize, adults don't recognize, is the importance of names for these children. This is a very important thing. A lot of kids will say, I don't feel respected. And so this is part of making the child feel safe. I also think talking about the fact that these are at-risk kids, right? I mean, at risk for homelessness, at risk for suicide, right? At risk for mental illness. And it is a small thing that we can do to make them feel safe. But, obviously listen to the parents. And I think, I would respond to the parents the same way if they called and said they had a problem with something else you were teaching, listen to them, but, also explain why you're doing it.
And to follow up, if a teacher asks a student for preferred pronoun, how do teachers educate the students in the same class that may not fully understand the use of the preferred pronoun?
These are I knew I was going to get questions like these. These are very specific, which is good. But again, I want to say that I would also rely on your own experience, as educators. And my 2 cents would be saying something like, many times students who, feel comfortable, don't feel comfortable being called she or her, would like to be called he and him. And we're going to respect that person's preference. The same way I would respect you if you said, stop calling me James and please call me Jim. Something like that. I try to educate them as far as you can.
Here's another good question. It's the ask is, what steps would you recommend for our schools to be proactive in terms of education about the LGBTQ community? Education for parents, students, the wider faculty, administration, and I'm going to add alumni and donors to that.
I think one of the most important things, frankly, to begin with, is the idea and the reality that these kids are at risk. And I think that many people think that this is some sort of fad or fashion. Okay. I think it's important to say, that if the kid is gay or, whatever, they're born that way. Right. And it's not a sin. It's not the sort of the fault, quote unquote, of their parents. I mean, we all know that. I hope we know that by now, but that these kids are really at risk. And you might start quoting them some statistics. I have an article about why should the church reach out to LGBTQ people. Youth are at risk. And I think one of the most important things to educate parents and alumni about is the fact that we're trying to provide a safe space for these people, for these kids. And also this flows out of our Marist charism and Jesus's invitation to reach out to people on the margins. All right. And, if you want to get super practical, you can quote some of the stuff that Pope Francis has written to me. Right. I mean, Pope Francis has talked several times about reaching out to LGBTQ people, and this is the one way you're doing it in the school.
Next question. Spiritually and philosophically, I'm with you and grateful for the gospel examples. What practical advice in dealing with the church authority, parentheses, the grumbling crowd, would you share?
First of all, always be respectful and charitable. It's the most important thing. Never always give people the benefit of the doubt. If someone has a problem with something, it doesn't mean they're homophobe or transphobic. Second, I think clearly state your position, which comes from the Gospels and comes from Jesus's desire to reach out to people and be clear about that. Third, I would say be free of the need for people to agree with you or like you or love you or approve of you. I mean, I say this to presidents, especially, that you may lose some donors, you may lose some families, but you're going to gain donors, right? And it is the right thing to do to help these people. And then, I would also say, again, remember that for these students and sometimes for these families, so we're talking, I think, one of the things we have to think about in terms of ministry to this population, to these students, is that it is not just ministry to them, to the students, but it's their family, their brothers and sisters, right? The extended family. Okay. It's a ministry to this group. And sometimes you really have to stand up for them. You have to take some heat. It's hard. And I think I mean, I would imagine, I wasn't alive then. I would imagine it would be the same when schools were integrated, right? So it's a different situation, of course, but you willing to take some heat. And now we look back at people who were educators who stood up for, African-American kids as heroes. And I think 50 years from now, we'll look at the people who stood up for LGBTQ kids and their families in the same way. So I would say, one, always be charitable. Always. Never sort of dismiss people. Two, be free of the need to have everybody like you. And three, be willing to take some heat.
Do you have any examples of situations where educators in Catholic schools have been of help in educating the bishop, the diocese, and its various offices about the LGBTQ community and the need to be inclusive if we are to be truly Catholic institutions?
I do. Some of the most surprising examples for me have been individuals that have, fortunately, opened up dialogues with the local bishop that have taken some months, sometimes years. And I had a guy who just today wrote to me, and it was talking about a success that he's had with the local bishop. I think that, oftentimes we're all like this. Sometimes Catholic leaders see these people as categories or as some political thing, right? Like they're responding to gender ideology, right? Which is false, right? I mean, a kid is not homosexual because he has read some book about something. I mean, this is simply the way that these children are born, right? But sometimes people get it in their heads that it's some political thing, right? Or it's some cultural thing. I mean, that may be part of the kind of conversation around it. But what I'm saying is, when they meet people as individuals, right? When they meet people and hear their stories, I think things change. And so perhaps, meeting the local bishop or the superintendent and talking about the stories of these families, right? Or even introducing the kid to them, I think really opens hearts. There's a reason why Jesus taught in stories. I think arguments and debate sometimes closes people's minds down. Stories, encounter, I think changes things. So I think anytime you can meet with the bishop and share these stories, it will help. But sometimes it's a long process. Sometimes it's a long process.
One of our attendees wanted to know if you could share the last article that you mentioned, which would have been a couple of answers ago.
Yeah, the article about it was why should the church reach out to LGBTQ people? I'll see if I can find that somehow while we're talking.
I'll find it. What was
No,
it?
no, I'll find it. I'll find it faster.
Okay.
So you can. So yeah, but please continue.
Okay. This next question: if a student has a desire to transition, is it appropriate for the school to advise a term of discernment to extend the process beyond high school years? Many times emotional issues go deeper than gender identification.
All right. So the article, which I don't know if I can figure out how to do it here, it's called "Why Should the Church Reach Out to LGBTQ People?" It's from August 2021 by me, James Martin, at America Magazine. So why should the church reach out to LGBTQ people? Some shocking statistics can answer that question. And it's about kind of how they're at risk. So it's 2021, just in August.
I've got it.
Okay. Thank you. And can you, there we go. Thank you. That was great technology. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. If a student has the desire to transition, is it appropriate for the school to advise a term of discernment to extend the process beyond high school years? Many times emotional issues go deeper than gender identification.
All right, this is one of the most complicated topics. I just finished this book, The Pink Line. It had a whole chapter on this. There's so many different ways of looking at this transition. The question of, is it too early, right? Even called puberty blockers, I guess. And will people regret it later on? And so I'm not a doctor. I'm not an endocrinologist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert on this. I can just offer my own 2 cents, which is this. It's very complicated. I do know that in general, people who transition are often much, much happier than they were before. I mean, they go from being suicidal to being comfortable with who they were. We have to think about that carefully, right? We can't dismiss that. I spoke to the head of Georgetown's LGBTQ Center recently, and I said, can you talk to me about transition? And she said, look, all I can tell you is the kids that come into my office, this is in college, before their transition, who are, feel like they're transgender, are miserable and suicidal. And after their transition, they're happy. So we have to take that seriously. By the same token, I do think that there are serious questions about doing it early, right? So if we're talking about high school, I think a period of discernment does make sense. I mean, that's a huge step. And obviously the parents, I think, would be more, kind of making the decision, but I think that's reasonable. What I think we should not do is to say that's ridiculous. You're just part of the gender ideology. It's a fad. You'll grow out of it. Because for a lot of these kids, I mean, I just met with a transgender man the other day. This is who he is, right? And so we have to take it seriously. But I do think discernment and patience and caution is not an unreasonable thing to do, as long as it's said in a way that is not rejecting of their experience and of what they're going through. That's a very hard question. And again, that I'm not an expert. This is like the leading edge of, kind of LGBTQ stuff.
Here's a curriculum question.
Uh-oh. Again, I'm not an educator, but I'll try.
And we read short stories, poems, novels that have non-heterosexual relationships. And they add, I have told teachers they can, as long as the description of the relationship or activity among the couple is not explicit, but rather understood or defined.
Well, I would say this. I mean, do you read? Okay, I would assume, and I know you're asking this in a sincere way, but I would assume that students read books where straight people have relationships that are not, when they're not married. And so I would tell the teachers the same thing. I can't imagine, I'm trying to remember a book. I just can't remember one, but there are books where men and women have sexual relations and they're not married. Right. I mean, that comes up. And so I would treat it the same way. You read books where people get murdered. Right. I mean, there's usually not a disclaimer. Right. So, I mean, these are all things that are not in keeping with the church. You read books where people aren't Catholic, right? Where people don't believe in God. They do all sorts of things. And so usually there's no disclaimer. So I would say, treat it the same way you treat any other short story that does not fully conform to church teaching.
And this question,
I mean, look at the Scarlet Letter. When you read the Scarlet Letter, right? Do you have to put a disclaimer on it, or you just teach it?
And the person who did ask this question points out that they teach Kite Runner and Speak, both with instances of sexual abuse of a child, and parents have not complained about them.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, because I think what has happened is the LGBTQ issue has become kind of the only thing that people are looking at in terms of church teaching. And there's all sorts of other things that, like divorce. I mean, we have how many children's books are about the child of a divorced family and how they make their way in the world, and people don't bat an eye. And so I think what has happened is that this has become such a lightning rod. And here's the point. I think that, if we sort of focus on the LGBTQ experience as the only sort of problematic issue, it really makes the LGBTQ kid feel really singled out. Whereas just say this is part of the human condition, as many of these other things are part of the human condition.
Good time for a couple of more questions before we wrap up.
Sure.
We'll get into the marriage issue. Definition of marriage in God's plan. When talking about same-sex marriage, the question of divorce is used indicating a broken or out of touch sacrament. How do we recognize the current situation of marriage and family to encourage students to reach that ideal?
Well, I guess I'm not sure if I understand the question. To reach the ideal, I guess if you're in a, can you ask that again?
It says, how do we recognize the current situation of marriage and family to encourage students to reach the ideal? And asking students to trust God's plan, students hear limits and don'ts. How do we stand firm in the church's teaching with love and acceptance as we ask them to be chaste?
Well, I think, by presenting the church teaching, but also by reminding them of the Gospels, the way Jesus, again, reaches out to people on the margins, by letting them know about church teaching, by letting them know about their conscience as well. I think that's an important thing to look at. I think if you're in a theology class or religion class, that's going to come up, obviously. But I also think it's recognizing that, look, there are other situations where people are married now legally, and we have to respect them. Can we respect them? You know, you might think about it in terms, again, if you're teaching religion, you would never say, you know, none of you should be Jewish, right? Or none of you should be Protestant, right? And so it's doing it in a respectful way by clearly stating what church teaching is, but by also sort of respecting people whose lives are not fully conforming with church teaching. I think that would be the key, because, you know, you might have a kid in your class who has, who's the child of same-sex parents, and you would never want them to feel somehow judged or excluded, right? Or less than. So I think there are ways of the same way you wouldn't want a Jewish kid to feel like that. So I think there's ways of doing it that are respectful, right, and loving.
And one final question. My experience is that on the university level, many Catholic students find limited relevance in the church's teachings about sexuality in general, including the public stance on gay men and lesbian women. Why can't people be allowed to love the people they want, is the question I often hear. What advice would you have about what we might do to help young people develop a way of looking at the world that includes an ethical system that will help them make decisions about their sexual lives within a broader context where the church's teachings in this area make little sense to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is correct. I would say a little gloss on that. You know, many Catholic students find limited relevance in the church's teaching. I think even like 10, 15, 20 years ago, the question is, how can I stay in the church, you know, with these teachings, particularly for LGBTQ people, but also for just young people in general who have so many LGBTQ friends. I think that's the other thing we have to remember. In the generation you're teaching, it's not just the LGBTQ kid in your class, it's all of them, because they all have LGBTQ friends. Okay, so it's a much wider population that these questions refer to. But what I was going to say was 20 years ago, the question was, how do I stay in the church? Now the question is like, it's not even a question. It's like, I'm leaving. I'm not part of this. They just leave because they're so turned off by the church's teaching. I find these 3 steps is really helpful. 1, know the Gospels. Know this Jesus who reached out to people in the margins. Know this Jesus who encountered the Roman centurion, the Samaritan woman, and Zacchaeus, right? And many people don't know that. They're stuck with simply what's in the catechism. Church teaching, again, is more than those few lines in the catechism. Know the Gospels, encounter Christ, allow this person to have an encounter with God in their life, or with Christ, right, in his or her or their lives. Understand church teaching, you know, as the person was saying earlier, you know, present church teaching, and then remind them of their conscience. Because in terms of an ethical system, you know, as the Second Vatican Council said, you know, conscience is the final arbiter, an informed conscience. And we can presume that someone who goes to a Marist school, who understands the Gospels, who knows church teaching, right, has a formed conscience. Okay. And so help them understand it in that context as well, not just sort of throwing a book at them, you know, because again, church teaching is not just a book, it's a person, and it is an encounter with mystery.
We are out of time. Do you have time for one more question?
I do. I see that very good question at the end.
All right. How would you deal with parents when a student speaks to you confidentially regarding their sexuality and they seem at risk?
I know I don't know the rules for education, okay, and for high school kids and whatnot. All of you do, you know, in terms of confidentiality. In the priesthood, I think part of it is saying, may I speak with your parents about this, right? Maybe sometimes they don't want to be out. If they are at risk, there are lots of different places you can go. There's a group called the Trevor Project. Maybe you can put that in the message. The Trevor Project has like suicide hotlines. There's a lot of places that you can go that are sort of run by secular organizations that are helpful. I would say maybe do the same thing that you would if you're in a similar situation where the kids, you know, and it's not the same thing as like abused or something like that, right? Like the confidentiality, but I would say there's a lot of resources. Again, I think the most important thing, this may be naive, is for the child, the young person, to have a place where they feel safe and welcome. And I think if they're talking to you, then that's half the battle. And thank you for placing that Trevor Project thing up there. It's really helpful.
I want to thank all of our attendees for being part of this. And Father, thank you very much. This was an illuminating hour. Appreciate your time very much. And Brother Dan will close things out.
Let me just say one more thing, but I just want to say thank you. I also want to say, again, this is just my 2 cents. I'm not an educator. I would think that within your group, you would have a lot of good ideas and good practices, and trust that God has put you there in front of these kids, not me, and not Pope Francis, and not some, whatever, psychologist, but you, and that God has put you there, and to trust that God wants you there to help this child. And anyway, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for trying to make your schools a more welcoming and safe place for these kids.
And lastly, to all that are on this conversation, immense gratitude on behalf of the province for taking part. Sincere gratitude, Father Martin, for your wisdom, for your insights, for your sharing of the gospel and making it really come to life in our lives. To Kevin, we are beyond grateful for your openness to making this happen. This was really, I think, another great step along the conversation journey that we need to continue to have as we move forward as educators. God bless everybody. Thanks for taking the time today. Amen.
Thank you. And if you could stay on before, I want to ask you some questions. Thank you, everyone.